In the silence of a prison camp thousands of miles from home, hunger gnawed deeper than chains, and the faint smell of smoke from distant American cook fires seemed like a cruel reminder of everything once taken for granted. For the Japanese soldiers, held as prisoners of war, the days blurred into one another. Monotony, discipline, and the slow erosion of pride. They had entered the conflict believing themselves unbreakable, warriors molded by centuries of tradition, loyal to an emperor. They had been taught was divine. Yet here across the Pacific, far from the shrines and ancestral homes they once knew, their bodies weakened, their faces hollowed, and their minds filled with questions they dared not speak aloud. They had lived on rations of watery rice, pickled, roots, or nothing at all during their final weeks of combat. Now, under American custody, they braced themselves for cruelty, expecting humiliation, deprivation, or perhaps even death. What came instead was something none of them could have imagined. Not a bullet, not a boot, but a meal. A simple plate. Of food that carried with it the shock of a new world, the taste of an enemy's abundance, and the beginning of a transformation none of them would ever forget. It was not just a matter of nourishment, it was an assault upon everything they thought they knew. The first bite would ignite memories of home, shatter illusions of superiority, and open the door to emotions they had buried beneath layers of war and indoctrination. This was not merely sustenance, this was revelation, delivered in the form of an American meal. The men shuffled forward, their sandals scraping against gravel, each step heavy with fatigue. A strange scent wafted toward them, richer and fuller than anything they had encountered in years of war. It was alien and yet irresistible. The Americans had summoned them to the mess area, though none could comprehend why. They expected rations. Perhaps another bowl of bland barley gruel or a hard crust of bread. Instead, steaming trays were being carried in, and the prisoners could scarcely believe what they saw. Thick slabs of meat, browned at the edges, sat atop plates of soft white bread. Beside them, bright yellow butter gleamed in the light, and bowls of steaming potatoes, mashed to creamy perfection, were waiting to be scooped. For soldiers raised in a land where rice was sacred and meat was rare, the sight itself was unsettling, almost sacrilegious. Their nostrils flared, their throats tightened, and for the first time in many months, they felt the sharp pang of hunger, not as suffering, but as desire. The guards did not jeer. They did not push. They simply pointed to the tables. The prisoners hesitated, exchanging glances as though walking into a trap, before slowly taking their seats. The first spoonful was tentative, as though the food might vanish before their lips. One man, his hands trembling, raised the fork and let the buttery potato touch his tongue. His eyes widened. Another cut into the meatloaf, seasoned beef, tender and hot, soaked with juices unlike anything he had known in his rationed soldier's life. The flavors exploded across his tongue, rich, fatty, and intoxicating. He chewed slowly, reverently, afraid that swallowing might end the moment too soon. Others followed, at first cautiously, then hungrily, the clang of forks and spoons growing louder as restraint gave way to appetite. It was not only the abundance that startled them, but the generosity of it. The sheer size of the portions, the way the Americans seemed unbothered to feed their enemies better than many of them had eaten in years. The men began to murmur, some whispering that perhaps this was not real, perhaps it was meant to weaken their spirit, perhaps even poison. But the warmth spreading through their bellies told another story. Their bodies, starved of nutrients, drank deeply from the nourishment, and in that moment the war seemed to loosen its grip, if only slightly, on their hearts. A slow pan across the faces of POWs eating, their expressions shifting from suspicion to wonder to quiet relief, some with tears welling in their eyes as they taste food they never dreamed of in captivity. For these men, eating had long been an act of survival, not pleasure. In the jungles of the Pacific, They had gnawed on roots, boiled weeds, and scavenged whatever scraps they could find. Now before them was food crafted not only for energy, but for comfort. The bread was soft, unlike the hard military biscuits they once carried in their packs. The butter melted at the slightest touch, sliding across the bread in golden streaks. Even the coffee, dark, bitter but invigorating, seemed like a potion from another realm. As the cups were filled and lifted, they felt the warmth seep into their veins, chasing away the chill of despair. Some lowered their heads, ashamed of their own eagerness, ashamed that they, warriors of the Emperor, could be moved by such things. Yet the tears betrayed them. One young soldier, barely 19, remembered his mother's kitchen in a distant fishing village. He had been told the Americans were demons, but demons did not feed their captives like this. Another man recalled the words of his commanding officer, "Better to die than be captured." Yet here he sat, alive, his stomach filling, his spirit trembling with a strange mixture of gratitude and guilt. They had lost the war, but in this moment, something more subtle was being won. Visual 4. A soft focus shot of empty plates stacked beside half-drunk cups of coffee, while in the background the POWs sit quietly, some staring at their hands, others gazing outward as if lost in deep thought. Silence followed the meal, but it was not the silence of despair. It was the silence of men reckoning with something they could not quite name. Their stomachs were full, but their hearts were unsettled. For years they had been told that America was decadent, soulless, weak, a nation incapable of sacrifice or honor. Yet here was proof of another reality. Here was food not merely to sustain, but to comfort, to heal, to offer dignity even to those who had once been enemies. Slowly, word spread through the camp. The Americans had fed them, truly fed them. That night, as they lay upon thin mats beneath wooden beams, the memory of that first meal lingered like an echo. They were not yet free, but something within them had shifted. War had defined them as enemies. A plate of food had begun to redefine them as human beings once more. A wide shot of the POW camp in the early morning mist, guards standing by the watchtowers, while inside the barbed wire, groups of Japanese prisoners gather quietly, the smoke of a breakfast fire drifting in the distance. The dawn came not with the sound of boots or rifles, but with the faint aroma of something cooking once again in the American kitchen. The memory of yesterday's meal still burned vividly in their minds, and as the men stirred from their thin blankets, their stomachs growled in a way they had almost forgotten. Hunger was no stranger to them, but hunger with the expectation of satisfaction was something new, almost luxurious. They formed lines once more, but this time it was different, less hesitation, more anticipation. The barbed wire still loomed, the guards still carried their rifles, and the humiliation of capture remained, but somehow the sting had dulled. They were still prisoners, but for the first time they did not feel like animals penned in cages. They felt strangely like men awaiting breakfast. The camp buzzed with whispers as some speculated on what might come. Would the Americans serve the same meal again, or was yesterday a fleeting miracle? They could only wait, their breaths forming clouds in the cool morning air, their eyes darting toward the smoke that promised warmth and food. A close-up of hands holding tin trays as American cooks ladle out scrambled eggs, sizzling bacon and slices of bread, the golden yolk glistening under the morning light. When the first trays were filled, disbelief spread once again through the prisoners. Eggs, fluffy, yellow, rich with butter, spilled across the plates, accompanied by strips of bacon whose salty aroma cut through the morning fog like fire through ice. Bread, soft and thick, was placed on the side, and a small pat of butter melted almost instantly upon contact. For men raised on rice and fish, this was a cuisine from another world. The sound of sizzling fat, the crackle of bacon, and the bright, yellow glow of eggs felt almost theatrical. as though the Americans were deliberately staging a performance to showcase their abundance. Some prisoners stared as if watching a dream unfold, while others clutched their trays with both hands, afraid it might be taken away. When they sat down to eat, silence reigned again, but this silence was charged with awe. The eggs melted in their mouths, soft and creamy, unlike anything they had known in the lean days of rationing. The bacon crunched, releasing waves of smoky salt that awakened every nerve in their tongues. Bread, soaked in butter, was chewed slowly, reverently, as though each bite needed to be memorized. For the prisoners, this was more than food. It was theater, it was shock. It was the dismantling of years of propaganda in a single breakfast. A panning shot of POWs sitting at wooden tables, some eating eagerly, others pausing mid-bite, as if lost in thought, their faces softening with the smallest flickers of gratitude. Slowly the conversations began. At first, murmurs in hushed tones, then fuller exchanges. One man spoke of his village, where eggs had been a rare luxury reserved for children or the sick. Another confessed that he had never in his life eaten bacon and could scarcely believe that such food existed in abundance. Others recalled their homes, their families, their mothers' cooking, and the ache of memory was as sharp as the satisfaction of the meal. Yet beneath the nostalgia was something more dangerous for the ideology that had carried them to war. Doubt. If America could feed its enemies with such generosity, what else had been hidden from them? If this was the land of excess, was excess truly weakness, or was it power disguised as kindness? The guards stood at their posts, rifles slung casually, but even they could sense the shift in the air. No one mocked. No one jeered. It was as though the food itself had created a fragile bridge between captor and captive. A bridge made not of diplomacy or negotiation, but of scrambled eggs and bacon. And as the men ate, some even dared to smile faintly, though they quickly looked away, embarrassed by their own humanity surfacing in a place meant to break it. A wide overhead shot of the camp's dining area after the meal, the tables littered with crumbs and empty cups, while the POWs linger, some sitting quietly, others looking out beyond the barbed wire as if imagining a world larger than the war. When the meal ended, the men did not rush back to their barracks. They lingered, reluctant to let go of the warmth in their stomachs and the odd calm that followed. A strange quiet settled over the camp, but it was no longer the quiet of fear. It was contemplation. Some men stared out past the fences, past the guards, past the horizon, as if trying to imagine the America that could produce such abundance. They remembered their homes, where mothers stretched rice to feed families of 7, where fathers worked fields that yielded barely enough to trade. They compared those memories to the plates of eggs and bacon, and though they did not speak it aloud, they wondered if the empire they had fought for had been built on illusions, while the land they had been told was soft and decadent might in truth be stronger than any of them had believed. That night, as the moon cast pale light across the wooden barracks, some prisoners whispered of a future they had never dared to consider. A future where they might return home carrying not only the scars of battle, but also the memory of meals that proved their world was larger than the war. And though the fences still stood tall and the war had left them broken, the taste of American food lingered like a haunting truth, reshaping their souls bite by bite. A slow fade-in of the prisoners months later, their bodies healthier, their cheeks less hollow, standing in small groups as they talked softly under the shadow of the guard towers. Time passed, and the camp transformed in ways none of the men could have predicted on that first night when they tasted bread and butter. At first, the meals were simply fuel, shocking reminders of a foreign abundance, but gradually they became part of daily rhythm, a steady heartbeat that replaced despair with cautious expectation. The bodies that had once been skeletal began to fill out. Shoulders once hunched with hunger now carried a trace of strength again. But the change was not merely physical. Inside their minds, the fog of propaganda began to lift, replaced by questions that refused to fade. If the enemy could feed them with such generosity, could he truly be the monster they had been taught to despise? Each bite of food had become a quiet act of persuasion, an argument delivered without words. The Americans did not preach, did not lecture. They simply placed meals on the table day after day until the act itself carried its own undeniable message. You are still human, and your enemy does not wish to strip that from you. A close-up of a young Japanese POW writing in a small, worn notebook, his face illuminated by the dim light of a lantern as others sleep around him. That message planted seeds that would bloom long after the war ended. Some prisoners, when given scraps of paper or the chance to write, recorded their astonishment, noting down the meals with the same reverence they once reserved for military victories. One man wrote of the first time he tasted peanut butter, describing it as strange, thick, yet sweet like nothing in Japan. Another wrote of coffee, marveling at its bitterness and warmth, admitting that the drink made him feel awake, not only in body, but in spirit. These records would become testimonies, surviving long after the fences had rusted and the camps had emptied, proof that a simple meal could change a man's outlook more than 1,000 speeches ever could. For those who had once vowed to die before surrender, who had believed capture was the ultimate disgrace, the meals became a lifeline, a reminder that survival could hold dignity, that the enemy's hand did not always carry a weapon, but sometimes carried bread. A panoramic shot of the camp's kitchen, American cooks preparing large pots of stew, while POWs glanced toward the steam rising from the pots with expectant eyes. As weeks turned to months, the camp itself became a peculiar classroom. Without intending to, the Americans were teaching their captives about more than food. They were teaching them about generosity, about resilience, about a culture that expressed its strength not through cruelty, but through abundance. Stew simmered in pots, rich with vegetables and chunks of meat. Corn on the cob was served steaming and golden. Pies appeared on rare occasions, their sweetness shocking men who had forgotten dessert even existed. Each new dish was like opening a door into another world, and the prisoners walked through cautiously, their palates expanding alongside their imaginations. In the beginning, some had feared poison, trickery, or humiliation, but the consistency of kindness eroded those fears. Even the guards, once faceless enforcers of captivity, became part of the strange ritual. They did not share the same tables, but their presence softened. Their voices carried less menace, as though the meals had humanized both sides in a way that barbed wire could not erase. Slowly, conversations stretched longer. Laughter, quiet at first, began to echo faintly across the dining hall. It was a fragile peace, but peace nonetheless. A wide, cinematic shot of the prisoners, months later, boarding trucks for repatriation, carrying small bundles, many turning to look back at the camp with expressions that blend relief, sorrow, and quiet reflection. And then, one day, it was time to leave. The war had ended, and orders came for repatriation. The prisoners gathered their few belongings, clothes worn thin, but bodies no longer broken. As they filed toward the trucks that would take them away, many paused to glance back, not at the fences, not at the watchtowers, but at the mess hall. It stood quietly in the morning light, its walls holding memories of meals that had reshaped their understanding of the world. Some whispered silent thanks, others bowed their heads briefly, carrying the memory with them like a sacred keepsake. When they returned to Japan, they would bring scars, yes, but also stories. Stories of eggs and bacon, of bread and butter, of stew and coffee that would astonish their families and confound their neighbors. For in those meals lay proof that the enemy had been human, and that humanity had reached them even in the darkest of times. Years later, When many of these men looked back on their captivity, it was not the barbed wire they remembered most vividly, nor the sting of defeat. It was the taste of that first American meal, a taste that had carried with it the power to transform, to humble, and to heal. In the end, it was not a weapon that broke them, nor a battle that changed them, but a plate of food shared in the silence of war.